January 1958. I think that many oldsters who have put our AA booze cure to severe but successful tests still find they often lack emotional sobriety. Perhaps they will be the spearhead for the next major development in AA, the development of much more real maturity and balance, which is to say humility, in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God. Those adolescent urges that so many of us have for top approval, perfect security, and perfect romance, urges quite appropriate to age 17, prove to be an impossible way of life when we are at age 47 or 57. Since AA began, I've taken immense wallops in all these areas because of my failure to grow up emotionally and spiritually. My God, how painful it is to keep demanding the impossible, and how very painful to discover, finally, that all along we've had the cart before the horse. Then comes the final agony of seeing how awfully wrong we have been, but still finding ourselves unable to get off the emotional merry-go-round. How to translate a right mental conviction into a right emotional result, and so into easy, happy, and good living? Well, that's not only the neurotic's problem, it's the problem of life itself for all of us who have got to the point of real willingness to hew to right principles in all our affairs. Even then, as we hew away, peace and joy may still elude us. That's the place so many of us AA oldsters have come to, and it's a hell of a spot, literally. How shall our unconscious, from which so many of our fears, compulsions, and phony aspirations still stream, be brought into line with what we actually believe, know, and want? How to convince our dumb, raging, and hidden Mr. Hyde becomes our main task. I've recently come to believe that this can be achieved. I believe so because I begin to see many benighted ones, folks like you and me, commencing to get results. Last autumn, depression, having no real rational cause at all, almost took me to the cleaners. I began to be scared that I was in for another long chronic spell. Considering the grief I've had with depressions, it wasn't a bright prospect. I kept asking myself, why can't the 12 steps work to release depression? By the hour, I stared at the St. Francis prayer. It's better to comfort than to be comforted. Here was the formula, all right, but why didn't it work? Suddenly, I realized what the matter was. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence on people, on circumstances, to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these things according to my perfectionist dreams and specifications, I had fought for them. And when defeat came, so did my depression. There wasn't a chance of making an outgoing love of St. Francis a workable and joyous way of life until these fatal and almost absolute dependencies were cut away. Because I had over the years undergone a little spiritual development, the absolute quality of these frightful dependencies has never before been so starkly revealed. Reinforced by what grace I could secure in prayer, I found I had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies upon people, upon AA, indeed upon any set of circumstances whatsoever. Then only could I be free to love as Francis had. Emotional and instinctual satisfactions, I saw, were really the extra dividends of having love, offering love, and expressing a love appropriate to each relation of life. Plainly, I could not avail myself of God's love until I was able to offer it back to Him by loving others as He would have me. And I couldn't possibly do that so long as I was victimized by false dependencies. For my dependency meant demand, a demand for the possession and control of the people and the conditions surrounding me. While those words absolute dependency may look like a gimmick, they were the ones that helped to trigger my release into my present degree of stability and quietness of mind, qualities which I'm now trying to consolidate by offering love to others regardless of the return to me. This seems to be the primary healing circuit, an outgoing love of God's creation and His people, by means of which we avail ourselves of His love for us. It is most clear that the real current can't flow until our paralyzing dependencies are broken and broken at depth. Only then can we possibly have a glimmer of what adult love really is. Spiritual calculus, you say? Not a bit of it. Watch any AA of 6 months working with a new 12th step case. If the case says to the devil with you, the 12th stepper only smiles and turns to another case. He doesn't feel frustrated or rejected. If his next case responds and in turn starts to give love and attention to other alcoholics, yet gives none back to him, the sponsor is happy about it anyway. He still doesn't feel rejected. Instead, he rejoices that his one-time prospect is sober and happy. And if his next following case turns out in later time to be his best friend or romance, then the sponsor is most joyful. But he well knows that his happiness is a byproduct, the extra dividend of giving without any demand for a return. The really stabilizing thing for him was having and offering love to that strange drunk on his doorstep. That was Francis at work. Powerful and practical, minus dependency and minus demand. In the first 6 months of my own sobriety, I worked hard with many alcoholics. Not a one responded. Yet this work kept me sober. It wasn't a question of those alcoholics giving me anything. My stability came out of trying to give, not out of demanding that I receive. Thus, I think it can work out with emotional sobriety. If we examine every disturbance we have, great or small, we will find at the root of it some unhealthy dependency and its consequent unhealthy demand. Let us, with God's help, continually surrender these hobbling demands. Then we can be set free to live and love. We may then be able to 12th step ourselves and others into emotional sobriety. Of course, I haven't offered you a really new idea, only a gimmick that has started to unhook several of my own hexes at depth. Nowadays, my brain no longer races compulsively in either elation, grandiosity, or depression. I have been given a quiet place in bright sunshine.
Thank you, Veronica. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dawn, to introduce our speaker.
Hi, I'm Dawn. I'm alcoholic. It is a pleasure to introduce this man to y'all. The things that I know about him is he has a kindness of spirit that is palpable when you're near him. And I've been aware of the depth of his experience over the past year and a half. Plus, I also know he's a successfully married person, which is a big deal in AA. So I'm gonna let you have the honor of listening to Derrick. Go ahead, Derrick.
Oh, that was sweet, Dawn. Thank you so much. My name is Derrick Mountain, and I am an alcoholic. And I'm getting a weird feedback from my end. I'm going to turn my volume down a bit.
Let me turn mine down, Derrick. There, it should go away.
I've been a sober and active member of Alcoholics Anonymous since September 29th of 2001. So last month I had the honor of celebrating 20 years of continuous sobriety. And my home group is the No Reservations group. We meet in Niwot, Colorado. I live in Frederick. Niwot is kind of in North Boulder. And we meet on Wednesdays at 6:30 if you're in the area. And I have a sponsor who knows he's my sponsor, and we're in regular contact. And I'm of service in Alcoholics Anonymous, and that looks like different things at different times. But I'm honored to be here, and that was a very nice introduction, Don. Thank you. I don't typically get very nervous when I speak, and I've been a little bit nervous about this one. I don't know if anybody else suffers from this, but I can have two polar opposite ideas going on in my head at the same time. And the one tells me I am maybe the least qualified speaker for this format. And the other one says, how can I possibly say everything I got to say in 45 minutes, right? But the truth is, and as my friend Kate reminded me, I don't have anything to say. God has something to say through me, and I'm not entirely sure what that is. So I've struggled a great deal myself with emotional sobriety. And I think for a long time, I didn't even know that I think it helps to have a phrase to put to it like emotional sobriety. I just thought I was doing the steps wrong, or I was missing something, or whatever, right? And I have actually within this last year finally sought some outside help and done some trauma work, in which I look back at some stuff from my childhood that I had kind of painted to be a rosier picture than I think it was in reality, and took a look at some stuff that was pretty uncomfortable, and I think maybe is at least partly responsible for why I am the way that I am, right? Like, we're a product of our upbringing, and certain things are ingrained in us, and emotions weren't something that were talked about very much in my house. Not in a way that was very productive anyways. And so this, coinciding with this outside help, I also did another set of steps with my sponsor, and it's been an experience. There have been years in my sobriety in which I'm not very emotionally in touch at all, I don't think. My wife will say, "How are you feeling?" And the best I can come up with is, "I'm hungry," or "My back hurts," right? Like, I know that's not what she's asking, but it's about as much as I can tap into sometimes. But I could put on a good face. I can sound good in an AA meeting. I can tell you I'm fine, thank you, how are you? And sometimes that's true. Sometimes I am fine. Sometimes I'm doing pretty good. But other times I'm not doing so good. And I don't even know how to explain that. I don't know how to put that into words. But I have an alcoholic brain that tells me, if I tell you the truth, if I tell you I'm not doing so good, if I tell you I'm standing in the dark, then that will equate to I'm doing something wrong in AA, or I'm not carrying a message of hope. And the truth is, it just, I don't feel that I get to experience the light without the dark sometimes, right? I don't get to experience the good without the bad. And so that's just simply been my experience. Maybe we'll get to some of that. But in looking back at my childhood, I was no stranger to alcoholism when I picked up my first drink. I was born to an alcoholic father, self-proclaimed. I'm not diagnosing him. And, my father was the funniest guy in the room and the hardest working guy you'd ever meet, until he picked up a drink, and then he was the scariest guy in the room. And he was unfaithful to my mother. He was very abusive to my mother. And so she got up the nerve to leave him when I was 4. My brother was 1. And they divorced, and my mother moved us initially into my grandmother's basement, and then shortly after that into low-income housing. And we spent many years in low-income housing. Our house was clean, but the neighbors not so much. We had a neighbor who would sweep out the cockroaches on a daily basis. Like, it was not a pretty picture. My mother raised us in a very strict fundamentalist religion. I'm careful not to say the name of the religion, because I think it's important that anybody who finds themselves in these rooms feels safe. But I can say enough about it that if somebody else has my experience, please reach out. You'll understand the language that I use probably. Please reach out if we can connect on that. But we did not celebrate holidays. When my classmates were doing Valentine's or coming to school for Halloween, I was probably in the corner doing a report on something, and I wasn't even probably going to get extra credit on it. And we spent our weekends knocking on people's doors, trying to convert them. I was expected to tell my classmates that the end of the world is coming. This was kind of a doomsday religion. The end of the world is coming, and if you're not on our side, you're going to fry. And my classmates thought I was kind of freaky for carrying that kind of a message in school, right? I mean, this is like 2nd and 3rd grade that I'm telling people this. And so I wasn't a very popular kid in school. My class would, start every morning, as many of us did, by standing and saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and I would politely sit in my chair and not say it. It was all part of my religious upbringing. And so there was this deep sense of separation. I felt very different from my classmates. But strangely enough, I also felt that way in my church. Like, I was a model little church boy. If you told me I needed to knock on 20 doors on Saturday morning to feel okay in my own skin, I was probably going to try and knock on 50. Like, I was an overachiever. I was trying to do whatever it was to make myself feel okay in this world. And I wasn't, I was old enough to know that there was something wrong with my dad, and it had something to do with whatever that stuff he was drinking. My mom would call him an alcoholic. She would when the child support didn't come in, or when he would make plans with us to get together and then not show up, she would use those opportunities to hammer into me that he's an alcoholic and you don't ever drink because you might have what he has. And I don't know today whether I have what he has. I don't know if it was a genetic predisposition. I don't really care. I just know I'm alcoholic, right? But I listened to her and I swore from a very early age, I'm never going to drink. It wasn't until I was in this therapy recently that it occurred to me, I don't recall her ever saying something like, it's not you. There's nothing wrong with you, 8-year-old little boy, that makes him not show up, right? He would probably get off work and intend to come meet us, but he'd say, I have enough time to go have a drink. And then he'd never leave the bar until they closed. Or he would forget that he'd made the arrangements to come see us because he was in a blackout when he made them. And it had nothing to do with us. But I didn't know that. As a little boy, I internalized this, right? There's something wrong with me that makes dad not show up. I remember one school event that he ever came to, ever. And I remember also that he made fun of me for that school event until well into my adult years. There was a little square dancing thing that we did. And he made fun of me for wearing cowboy boots because he was a hard rock guy and people who listen to country music were weak and all this. He had all these strange beliefs and made me feel like there was something wrong with me because I participated in this school event doing square dancing, right? So I have all this stuff in me, but I'm just thinking, if I'm a good enough little boy, then dad's going to show up. My mother, looking back, suffered from untreated Al-Anon. She suffered from the family disease of alcoholism. She had been raised by people who were raised by alcoholics, so she had much of that ingrained in her. She had married my father and divorced, and now was left kind of to hold the reins to raise 2 little boys, right? And I can't imagine how hard it was in the early 80s to be a single mom raising 2 little boys and getting us to church 3 times a week and putting food on the table. I know mom she worked 2 and 3 jobs sometimes, but at some point in the early to mid 80s, she settled into a deep depression. And I didn't know that's what it was. She would get up and she'd get us to school and she'd go to work and she'd come home and make dinner sometimes. Sometimes she would ask me to make dinner and she would go to bed. And it was like that for years. And in this religion we were raised in, I was raised to believe that if I'm not going to church 3 times a week and I'm not knocking on those doors, I'm going to burn with everybody else. So at, let's call it 10 years old, I felt responsible for getting my brother and I dressed and finding us a ride to church 3 times a week, so that we could not burn when Armageddon comes. And it wasn't until I was, into my adult years that I look back and realized that forced me to mature much faster than I probably should have. There was very little playing going on. If I wasn't in church, I was doing homework or preparing for church. There wasn't a lot of playing going on. And because I matured fast, I was put into positions within that church that were leadership positions at a very early age. And so my ego started to grab onto this sense that I'm okay if other people put me in a position like that, where there's responsibility and there's expectations, and I'm living up to the expectations at 12 years old or 13 years old of a grown man. And it was a heavy weight, but it was also that approval that I was seeking, that false approval that I thought would make me okay, right? Bill writes in the big book that lack of power is our dilemma. And lack of power was certainly my dilemma. I loved to read. I loved to watch movies. I loved to escape into these fantasy worlds. And I loved to sit in class and daydream literally about what it would be like to wake up in somebody else's life, with somebody else's parents and somebody else's skin, with toys that weren't from the Goodwill and clothes that weren't from the Goodwill. I got good grades, but I was constantly in trouble for being a daydreamer. And I wasn't dreaming about what it'd be like to go out and play ball. I love to read books about people who had lived through horrific circumstances, like the Holocaust. And I because even though I was dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's in this religion, I felt no presence of God. Now, maybe they talked about it, but I never heard it. This was not about having a personal relationship with a power greater than myself. This was about following the rules so I don't die tomorrow, because literally we were brought up to believe that the end of the world could come tomorrow. And so I would read these stories about people who had lived through civil unrest or the Holocaust or these horrific experiences, and marvel at their faith, marvel at the faith that got them through these intense circumstances. And I was very envious of that, right? And so I would daydream about, what if I was born with a different color of skin or in a different place in time, almost wishing that I'd had some sort of persecution so that I could have this faith in this God that I didn't feel like I could tap into. And I remember a day very vividly when I was 16 years old. I had just turned 16, and I had dropped out of school at this point. We only went to school because it was the law, not for an education. In fact, continued education was forbidden. There was no hope of ever going to college. And so I dropped out of school. I was learning a trade. I was learning to be a painter. I was homeschooling myself with the intention of getting at least a diploma. And I was also knocking on doors for 90 hours a month at this point. Mom was very checked out, very rarely even made meals at this point. And I remember sitting in my room just overwhelmed by this sense of probably self-pity, right? Like, I can't go on the rest of my life feeling this way. And at the same time, just scared to death of, what if this is as good as it's ever going to get? What if, I mean, this feeling of separation has been compounded over the years. Now I'm 16 years old. There's no hope of education. There's, I have a few friends, but I'm convinced they're pity friendships or whatever. And I know I can't go on the rest of my life feeling this way. And a couple of days later, I was hanging out with some guys who were drinking, and they handed me a Mickey's. And I drank it as hard and as fast as I could. And about 2/3 of the way through that thing, I felt like my shoulders came down from around my ears, and I let go of a breath that I've been holding on to for a long, long time. And I found power in the bottom of that bottle. I will not say that it was a spiritual experience, but it sure mimicked one. Many trips through the steps, I see how I steal my feel goods from this universe, and I kind of identify my
Is Derrick frozen for everyone or just for me?
drank for the
For me
next
too.
9.
Frozen.
Maybe he's coming back here for a second.
Frozen.
We lost him. He'll sign back in, I think. Let's see what we get here.
Boy, I don't know what happened. I just lost you all for 2 seconds. So that's how I drank for the next 9 years. I had to figure out how to get the booze, and that didn't take much effort because I had dropped out of school. I had a paycheck, and I was able to get booze on a pretty ready basis. I had roommates that were over 21. I moved out when I was 17, had roommates that were over 21. And I just would get up and go to work and come home and drink, and get up and go to work and come home and drink. And this was at 17 years old, right? I was not active in the church anymore, but I was still showing up to enough events that they thought I was. And when I was 19, I was starting to have some consequences. I'd gone through a couple of those roommates in pretty quick succession. It's funny, they didn't appreciate that I had money for booze every night, but I didn't have money for rent on the first. I didn't understand this. Like, what's your problem, right? And when I was 19, I'd been dating this woman who'd also been raised in the same religion, also was not practicing, seemed to party like I partied. And in an effort to control my drinking, really, we got married. It was not a good marriage, but I really thought that if I get married, I will have to be an adult. I will have to show up for work every day. I'll have to come home with the paycheck every month. every week. I'll have to do all these things that I imagine adults do. And so in an effort to control my drinking, I got married at 19, and I was just drunk all the time. And by then we'd started experimenting with some other things. And I was trying to, I really felt like I was able to tap into some spirituality or some emotion when I dropped a lot of LSD. And so I did that as often as I could. And in probably about 97, I started getting into meth. And I don't talk about that when I'm in a regular AA meeting, but I'm a meth addict as well. I have a very clear first step as an alcoholic and as a meth addict. I've done a lot of other drugs, and I am not addicted to those. I doesn't mean I'll go pick them up, but I'm not addicted to those. And I sought, a solution for my meth addiction in Cocaine Anonymous. But it seemed to liven me up. By nature, I'm been compared to Eeyore sometimes, right? Like, I'm not a big, bubbly, smiley guy all the time. And meth kind of gave me that for a little bit. I felt like I was able to talk more easily, and my head held a little higher. And it wasn't long before that was totally the opposite. I was, hiding in my garage from the people that weren't really there, and all the insanity that comes with meth addiction. But at any rate, I was in 2000, I was arrested on 3 felony cases for 16 felony charges, and given an opportunity to sit still in county jail. And I did so with some serious resentments. There were a couple of people in my life that I was very close to that had kind of committed some what I deemed to be unforgivable sins. It was like the ultimate betrayal. And I sat in county jail with nothing to tamper my feelings. No booze, no meth, no cigarettes, no nothing. And just felt it. And I knew that this was going to eat me alive. And I didn't know what to do about it. There was no Alcoholics Anonymous in the jail in the jail that I was in. But there was a lady who came in and brought in a class. I think it was like a drug and alcohol class. And she identified herself as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I got to talking to her one day and asked her, how do you forgive? Like, I knew I needed somehow to forgive these people, and I had no idea how. And she was perplexed. She did not have an answer. She came back the next week with some handouts, and I would just sit in my cell and imagine like love and forgiveness coming into me and pushing out all the negativity. And it didn't do a lot of good because I didn't have a solution yet, right? I didn't have an inventory to write. I didn't have anything. All I knew was that I had been wronged, and I couldn't look beyond that. But what happened was I was sentenced to a community corrections facility in which Alcoholics Anonymous came in, and they brought their stories. And the very first person who I ever heard at all was a speaker one morning. It was Don Pritz. And he told my story, and I was hooked. I didn't know exactly what he was talking about, but he was pretty clear that as the result of working the 12 steps, being an active member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and then he had a life that made sense to him. And that was kind of the promise that he offered. If you do this, if you join us and you find you're alcoholic, it was not assumed I was alcoholic because I was in a correctional facility. It was assumed I broke the law, right? If you find that you're alcoholic and you join us and you do what we did, you do the black on the white in the big book, you can have a life that makes sense to you. And that was the biggest carrot I think he could have dangled for this alcoholic, because life had never made sense. It didn't make sense. The dad didn't show up. It didn't make sense that the mom didn't get out of bed. It didn't make sense, all these things. And now it didn't make sense that I was living in a correctional facility where I was told what I was going to do and what I was going to wear and where I was going to be 24 hours a day, right? And I got a sponsor right off the bat, and we started to work steps. And I started to do as best I could this step work. And there was an immense amount of freedom when I finally got to that point where I could admit that I'm an alcoholic. And finally, there's a name to put to what's wrong with me. And we, I think, just barely scratched the surface on all the other stuff. But as I got into that inventory, and particularly inventory on those couple of people who had really betrayed me, I was able to set aside entirely the wrongs they had done and seen where I was at fault, where I was a bad friend, a bad right? Like all these things that I had done, regardless of what they had done. And I was able to approach them in a ninth step without bringing up their faults at all and make amends. And there was an immense amount of freedom that came from that. Eventually, both of those individuals got sober themselves for a period. They're not sober today. They also went through the process and were able to make amends to me. And if I see them on the street today, there's no ill will between any of us, right? That was a miracle that came as a result of this. But I wasn't necessarily tapping into emotions. There was an elation. There was the pink cloud. There was this, just this feeling, because I'm no longer bound by the alcohol and the other things that I'm doing. I'm no longer literally running from the law. I'm no longer hiding in dark rooms, afraid that they're out there and going to come get me. I'm have a job. I'm going to meetings on a regular basis. I'm meeting with a sponsor. There was a huge amount of relief that came just from that, right? And I started to fall in love with Alcoholics Anonymous. I found myself pretty quickly falling into a group that was, get in the car type of sponsorship. And that's how I wound up at the Fellowship of the Spirit conference. That's how I wound up at a central office group inventory one time. I wound up at these workshops, and I wound up with running around with people in Alcoholics Anonymous who were on fire for this thing that we're doing. They were on fire for service and for step work and for the message of depth and weight that's carried in the big book. But there wasn't necessarily talk about emotional sobriety. And I think I started to compare myself to how I assumed they were doing, right? I've had two sponsors that are huge meditators. Like they get up 3 or 4 hours before work to meditate. I had one that goes to India, not during COVID, but prior to COVID, he'd go to India twice a year, literally to meditate on mountaintops with gurus. And so I envision that Marty is levitating at least 6 inches off the floor every time he meditates, and I can't levitate at all. Or every time he meditates, I can't levitate at all. So what's the use in trying, right? And so my 10th step, my 11th step were very lacking. I was hesitant to 10th step on a regular basis and tell my sponsor or anybody really what's going on inside my brain. And because my head tells me if I tell you the truth, you'll know that I'm sick. If you know that I'm sick, eventually you're just going to kick me out. And if you kick me out, I'm going to drink. And if I drink, then I'm going to die. And I'll go do that in about 3.5 seconds. So I'll just tell you I'm fine. Thank you. How are you? And so I started very early on, maybe a year, 18 months into this, with that I'm fine, thank you, how are you mentality. And I found myself, I think I had about 2.5 years in my very first dark place. And I was going to a traditions study, and I was taking these principles that were lovingly being handed to me, and I was softly in the background sharpening them into tools. And I was taking the traditions and the principles laid out in them, and I was judging your group and my group and everybody's group, because there isn't rotation, or your 7th tradition isn't whatever, or you don't have a regular business meeting group conscience, whatever. There was all these things, and I was judging everybody, and I think it was all with good intention, but it put me in a place where I felt very separated in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I did an inventory, and I saw exactly what I was doing. And I saw that there was this huge lack of humility. And I took that to God in 6 and 7. And I don't have time to get into it, but the result was that I met my wife through that experience at the Fellowship of the Spirit conference. But that was my first time that really I found myself in a dark place in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was afraid that I was, again, not doing it right, that I had missed something in my step work, that I had whatever. Now I know that because that experience placed me in a position where I had to ask for help. I had to seek a new power. I had to go through the steps again and have a fresh awakening, so that I could get to the other side and look back and say, now I've had that experience. Now I could be a demonstration to others what it looks like to walk through that experience and not get loaded, right? I didn't get drunk through that. I just didn't feel very good. And so I met who was to become my wife at the Fellowship of the Spirit conference in 2004. And we were married about 1.5 years later, and we were just this happy little couple in AA, right? Like boy meets girl on AA campus kind of thing. And She had her Al-Anon groups and I had my AA groups and my CA groups. And at that point, I was actually going to Al-Anon as well. I found myself, I guess I should talk about this. I found myself obsessing over my dad's drinking. And I was convinced that he was like lying in a room dead somewhere. And I twice left a service commitment to go drive across town to see if he was dead or alive. And I was just bound up in knots around this. And he was in really, really bad shape. But I was kind of like, I was stark raving sober. And I was, trying to get him to meetings. Don was giving a talk downtown one time, and I took my dad down to meet him and thought, well, if my dad just meets Don, then that'll be the trick, right? And he was coming to a big book study that we had, and I was, I was really trying to manipulate my dad, his life and his drinking. And I joined Al-Anon for a while and went through the set of steps, and really, really found it beneficial. But at any rate, my wife and I, we got married and started to plan a family. And at the time, I had a couple of very heavy service commitments that took up a lot of time. And now we're planning a family, and Sue had gotten pregnant, and there was a lot of fear going on. There was a lot of fear that I was going to be a bad father, that I wasn't going to be able to show up, that I wasn't going to be able to provide for my family. And I did an inventory. I did a whole set of steps. And in that inventory, there was some heavy stuff on there, like that I wasn't going to be able to provide for my family, that my dad, I was going to wind up having to take care of my dad with his alcoholism. At the time, he was locked up in Arapahoe County Jail on his 12th DUI. And I also had a fear that there were going to be some complications with the pregnancy. And I won't get into the whole story. If you've heard my story, you've heard it before. But in a period of just like 3 months, all of that happened. Sue wound up in the hospital for 6 weeks prior to our little girl being born premature. My dad got out of jail and started drinking and was in the ICU by that evening and never walked out. He spent the last 6 weeks of his life in the ICU and then in hospice. And then I lost my job. And it was 2008. It wasn't anything I did. It was the state of the economy at the time, right? Things were crashing. And I found myself out of work with a teeny little baby and a new wife and with a mortgage and an immense amount of fear. And doing my best to 10th step that, to continue to show up for my service commitments, to continue to show up and sponsor guys, but at a total loss of how to take care of myself, how to deal with these emotions. And I don't know that I ever really did that well, right? Like, I think on some level, they got stuffed inside me, and I just knew that I wasn't going to be able to take care of this. God was going to have to take care of it. And he did. And we wound up, getting through it. And as a family, being a demonstration of others, being being that third step in action, God took away our difficulties so the victory over them could bear witness to others. I absolutely believe that was true. But at the same time, like, that fear never really got much more than just acknowledged. And the other thing that happened shortly after that was, as I rotated out of each of those positions, I realized how much my ego was wrapped up in the position. There was a lot of opportunity for people to say very nice things to me. And there was, in the long form of the 12th tradition, Bill writes that we are to practice a genuine humility. Humility is not something that comes natural to me. I know people who it does, and I watch them. I'm envious. Humility does not come natural to me. It's something I have to kind of practice and pray for and seek. And there was enough people saying nice things to me through these service commitments that my head started to believe it a little bit, and it scared me. And as I rotated out of those positions, I kind of ran away. Like, I was still going to my home group. I was still meeting with sponsees, but I was hiding as much as I could. I picked a home group where you literally might only share once a year. You might only, it's a speaker call up. I probably shared 3 or 4 times a year, but in theory, you could only share once a year on your birthday. And if that's what's going on, then I don't have to be vulnerable. I don't have to be honest about what's really going on right now. I can just kind of hide out in AA. And if I'm not in a position where I'm speaking or leading in some service capacity, then there's not opportunity for people to say nice things to me, and there's not opportunity for my ego to grab onto that. I know now that wasn't the healthy response. It wasn't even necessarily a conscious response. It was, I think, kind of preservation at the time. And it was a couple of years of that before my friend Sarah, she was a DCM, and said, "Oh, I've been watching you and it's time to stop hiding. I think it's time for you to be a service," and asked me to be a district corrections chair. And that was perfect timing. It was the perfect thing for what I needed to do at the time. And I love corrections work. I think it's very fulfilling. I was able in that position to go back into the building I was housed in for 6 months and take a meeting in there. And it was very, very fulfilling work. But it was kind of in hindsight that I realized what I'd done, that I had tried to manage my life, and I tried to manage my emotions and manage my humility and my ego by just disappearing as best I could. And there's not, good, bad, or indifferent. It's just my experience. It's just simply what I did through that experience, right? But I have since then found myself several times in that dark place. And I think that the difference is that I try and talk about it. I recognize it much sooner than I did then. And I make a concerted effort, not in an effort to like carry this message of doom and gloom and Alcoholics Anonymous. Absolutely not that, right? Like when things are really good, I'm sharing that things are really good. But some of the most powerful talks I've heard are from people who have 30 years and they're checking all the boxes and they're just saying, "I'm fine, thank you, how are you?" But they have a loaded gun under their pillow. And I think there's an immense amount of freedom that comes from the humility to say, "I'm not doing so hot." And to let others know it's okay to not be doing so hot in Alcoholics Anonymous. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It doesn't mean you're missing something. Like, I am continuing to seek God's will for me. I am continuing to try and enlarge my spiritual life through different meditation practices, through 10th step and 11th step practices. But I go through the steps maybe every 16 to 18 months. I try and stay on top of that inventory, but I also know that any business that stays only in inventory isn't open for business. So I'm not constantly going through the steps back to back to back, but I am trying to be aware as best I can of where I'm at, what I'm doing, how the bedevilments are manifesting themselves in my life, and be a little bit easier on myself, not hold myself up to quite so high of a standard. But the emotions continue, the emotional sobriety continues to elude me. And I don't know. I wish I could put my finger on what it is. I wish I could just, take the magic potion or say the secret prayer or whatever it is that's going to get me there, right? But I'm a little strange. Like, I feel more comfortable speaking to a room of 5,000 people from the podium than I do being a greeter at my home group. There's a disconnect there if I'm speaking on the podium, whereas if I'm one-on-one with you, that small talk is eventually going to lead to something personal, and that can be uncomfortable for me, right? Two, like I told you, I have a hard time when my wife asked me, "How are you feeling?" trying to tap into that whole situation when she was in the hospital for 6 weeks, and then our little girl was born 5 weeks premature. I don't think I cried through any of that. When my dad died, I didn't cry for a week. I tried. I rented all the sad father-son movies I could. I listened to all the right songs, trying to like squeeze a tear out of me. What happened was I sat down and I wrote the eulogy I was going to read at his service. And when I was done, I asked Sue to listen to it. And I got about 2 words into saying it out loud, and I just lost it, right? I envy people who can really tap into their emotions and freely cry. That's not me. But I tell you what, if I see somebody like Sunday Morning does these exposés on people, and they'll get me going. Also, the Down syndrome couple is crowned king and queen of the prom and I start crying, or I hear the right song and I start crying. There's some strange detachment where if it's somebody that I don't know, I'm not related to, there's no risk of me running into them. I can cry for that, but there's not so much when it's something family. And I don't know what that is. Some of that trauma work that I've done has lessened that up some. I think there's more work to be done, certainly, and there's certainly more work to be done in my 11th step and asking God for His will for me. I'm not blind to it, but I also don't have the answer for it, right? And so it's something that I think frustrates my wife sometimes. That I cry when I hear a Mandolin Rain by Bruce Hornsby, but I don't cry when she's having a tough day or whatever, right? I wish it was different, but it's not. It's just how it is right now. But I trust that as long as I continue to stay on this path, as long as I continue to seek God's will, then God's going to bring that out when it comes out. I'm going to get cracked open when I get cracked open. And I think there's a piece, there's a little fear there that once I get cracked open, I might not be able to stop crying or something, like I don't know what that is, but it's there and I acknowledge it. So, Don alluded a little bit to my last year or so. 2020 was very difficult. It started out really good. I was in a new position for a new company that had acquired my old company. I was getting healthy. I was eating right. I lost 15 pounds. Things were really going quite well. And then pandemic hit. I was sent home to work. My girls were schooling from home like everybody else, right? Life just got turned upside down. And then I woke up one Sunday morning in debilitating pain. Totally, completely out of nowhere. I could not lift my head off my chest. My shoulder was in excruciating pain, like white hot pains shooting down my arm. My fingers were numb. And that happened on a Sunday. I saw several doctors over the course of that week who were baffled. And on Friday, I had an MRI where they said, you need surgery right now. I had 3 herniated discs that were bulging and pushing on my spinal cord. So my spinal cord was about like this. And that was the night that Fellowship of the Spirit was in Colorado was starting on Zoom. And I was in an immense amount of fear, an immense amount of pain, and totally at the mercy of the doctors. And I had the surgery. And when I woke up at, I don't know, midnight, the pain was 90% of the way gone. Like that was the solution. I still to this day have numbness in these 3 fingers. That was on July 31st of 2000. But it started this long rehab process, right? And I was, working from home and making sure my girls were on their school and going to physical therapy twice a week and all this stuff. And then in November, I had another surgery unrelated to my neck. And in December, my whole family got COVID and I got it really bad. Not nearly as bad as some, but I was down for 16 days and wound up in the ER. And I realized on the other end of the COVID, like as I was overcoming the COVID, that almost from the beginning of the neck pain through the COVID, I'd been relying on me. I'm sure I prayed during that time. I'm sure I was seeking God, but it was pick myself up by my bootstraps, get through this, and just push on and be strong for my family and be strong for AA and all this stuff. And that was a trigger. As soon as I realized that, like I knew something needed to change and it needed to change now. And it was within a couple of weeks that I was, in the therapy. It was within a couple of weeks that I was working steps again with my sponsor and starting to have a new experience. And so, that was, end of 2020, beginning of 21. And this year has been entirely different, right? Like some things have lessened up. I'm still working from home, but the kids are back in school. Like those things have changed. But it's been more about my relationship with God. It's been more about my recommitment to Alcoholics Anonymous. Zoom afforded me to get to way more meetings than I was prior to COVID, right? But as things started to open up and I started to be able to go to in-person meetings, I realized how much I missed being in your presence, right? We had Fellowship of the Spirit in person this year. Colorado had our state convention in person this year. We're going to have our second in-person assembly this weekend. Tomorrow, I'm going to go get to hang out with 200 or so of you as we talk about area service work and really how we can do the best for Alcoholics Anonymous as a whole. And I didn't realize how much I missed that until I had it back, right? My home group for many months was hybrid, and we all sat facing the screen with our backs to each other, right? And the first week that we did away with hybrid and circled up and went around the room, you know, my name's Derrick, I'm an alcoholic. I got choked up and started crying a little bit at that, just because I could see their eyeballs when they identified themselves. And I didn't realize how much that was going to affect me until it did. So my commitment to Alcoholics Anonymous has, I've really kind of redoubled my efforts in the last year or so. And I'm just so grateful for this process, and that there's groups like this that are talking about the deep stuff like we are tonight, right? Like, tell me where it hurts. Tell me what's really going on. You got some really good stuff going on. I want to hear that. You're having a phenomenal experience and awakening. You had some killer amends. You had a huge, aha moment in your inventory. Tell me about that. But if it's dark, tell me about that too. I want to hear about the darkness too, because I think it's only by grabbing each other's hands and walking through the dark that we get to the other side and into the light. And so with that, I don't know if any of that made any sense, but I'm really glad it's done, and I'm going to shut up now. Thanks.
Thank you, Derrick. It's sort of traditional in this meeting that the speaker call on a few people, and it's dealer's choice. I think he's frozen again. So in that case, I am going to call on Wendy from Astoria.
Thanks, Don. Thank you so much, Derrick. Yeah, it is really hard for me to admit when it's not going well too. I had a bad day this week and I haven't told anybody about it. And it's not that I haven't had the opportunity. And it wasn't because I thought I wasn't doing it right. It's just, I'm having a bad day. I'm not really sure, what it was all about, but this program gives me that opportunity to plug back in as soon as I can. And I'm amazed that it works. It's that line in the book where it says it works. It really does. And it's a surprise every time. I don't know why it's still so surprising, but I really enjoyed hearing your story, as painful as it was. But it's what ties us together. The fact that our stories are different, but the solution is the same. And it's available. So this thing works. I think I'll keep coming back. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Wendy. Now that I'm unfrozen again, I'd like to hear from my friend Maggie in Grand Junction.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Derrick. I'm Maggie. I'm an alcoholic. Even if you didn't call on me, I was actually going to speak tonight because I just wanted to say thank you. And I'm really grateful that you're my friend. I've learned so much from you over the years, even though we have limited contact. And I got to tell you, I feel like I'm floating right now and I'm going to cry. I just love being in the presence of this and this heart, and just to feel your vulnerability, it gives me this place where I can't name what I'm feeling. Things are fine, except that for years, kind of like you were talking about, like kind of hanging out in that meeting where it was just a speaker meeting and, you talk like 3 times a year or whatever. I do attend a wonderful meeting every single day and I participate, but I don't want to go back into in-person meetings. Like the COVID has pulled me back to where I like to be, which is like, I would like to disappear if I could. And it's only about 3 weeks ago that I've gone back into the clinic where I work in healthcare. And it's hard. It's not just that. My work life has been a really kind of calm thing for a long time. And I've worked at this hospital for like 16 years. And it's like somebody came in and just blew it up with dynamite. Like my team's gone. I'm the only one left. It's like, I don't know what to do. And I'm so overwhelmed. And I wish I could just slow down and feel it, but there's this drive to get so much done. And I don't know, there's like a part of me that feels like you shouldn't be talking like this right now. Like, where's God? And I was praying, but I'm overridden by fear. I feel like there's just so much fear. I come home and I can't even talk. And I got home just a little while before the meeting, and it just feels good to say this out loud. I don't even know what I'm afraid of. I think part of it is that, in this job, I have done such a good job hanging in the back, but now I have to be in the front, and I don't want to fall. And I'm already falling because I can't do this. And there's no one to actually help. There's just nothing to do except like do it. And I know that I prayed for this. I can feel that. It's like just letting go in a way that I never have before around this. I think, when I was little, it was like, I'll dance as fast as you want me to. I'll do whatever, just love me. Don't leave me, don't hurt me. And I don't know, so I'm just getting really triggered by this. So I really appreciate you calling on me. I just listened to you recently when you shared on one of the steps on the Fox CDs. And anyway, I love you. And I love listening to your wonderful wife too. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Maggie. How about Sarah Mickelson?
I'm Sarah. I'm an alcoholic.
Sarah.
Good job, buddy. I love Alcoholics Anonymous, and I think, you get blessed to like have these, I don't know, just get to watch people. And I'm really glad you said yes to that corrections gig when I asked you to do the district corrections thing, because you did a great job for the district, and I appreciate you very much. But I also appreciate just a long-standing friendship and just real conversations. And I can think of multiple times when my butt's fallen off and you and your wife have been there, and it's just cool to be on the road. I haven't been here in a couple of weeks. I was out of town and whatnot, so it's really nice to dial back in. I think some things are like, I was thinking about step work. I was thinking about this idea of going through the steps more than once, but it's not always like there's this. What I appreciate about this meeting is there's this idea that like. You can do this work, but like, I think sometimes you do work at, like I have tried to use the steps as like a tool for a fix, when really it's like always about this relationship with God. And sometimes the pain or suffering or things that are like needed. I don't know how else to say it, because you're changing. And I like the book talks about, this idea that we have a personality change, that it can be like huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. And I find that very comforting, because, if I'm not careful, I can think, well, I'm doing my 10-step and I'm like a little robot, and my service and my whatever, and forget about the human factor, that life is life, and we are like, I'm who I am and having this experience, and that's not simple, none of it. And it's possible to be sober, right? And also those things that are the most difficult can be useful to others, right? Even while you're going through them, or just the honesty around that. And that's sort of what I heard in what you were saying in your talk, which I appreciated very much. And I think that's all for me, but I'll look forward to being one of those couple hundred people this weekend at the assembly with you. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Emerson, I don't know you, but you look like you got something deep to say. You're muted.
Thanks, Derek. I was actually going to raise my hand. Well, first of all, I like the whole cue ball thing. I got that going as well. And you really said some important stuff. You said a lot of truths that are truths for me that I have not said. And I'll start with the whole, my mom was very ill when I was growing up. She suffered from depression and mental illness. And I used to have to take care of my younger brother and younger sister. And, I'd do the stuff for them at home and then go to school and get in fights. And, it was just, I had to kind of grow up and maybe take some responsibility that I didn't want. And the one thing you said that really stuck, one of the things that really stuck out is, I used to do sales and marketing for a living. So I can go to any business situation or whatever and talk and be assertive, express my ideas and all that. But I was terrified when I'd go to AA meetings. I would sit in the car, pretend I'm on my phone, and I'd make kind of so you can actually see it. I'd pretend I'm on the phone and sit there and do that until it was time for the meeting to start, because I dreaded small talk. I dreaded somebody like, hey, how are you? Or, I'm like, what am I going to say to this person? What even more, when they would have this little conversation going with a group of 3 or 4 people, it literally to me at times almost sounded like a different language. I just felt so out of place and so scared. And who would have thought that I would have, connected on that level with you today? And, the things you talk about, the big thing is this, the feeling that if I say that I'm not doing okay in AA, I equated that to like, something's wrong with my program. I'm bad. I'm about to relapse. I've got to be super positive and kind of like be, whatever. And I could be dying inside and you would never know. You would never know. But fortunately, I have a good sponsorship. And now I have 1, 2, 3 step 10 and 11 partners. And we call each other and talk about our 10 and 11. And for me, it's kind of a safe, it's like putting my toe in the water to be able to tell people, on a regular basis, hey, I had a bad day. I'm not doing that good today. And for me to realize that it's okay for me not to be perfect in AA, for me not to, to have maybe blown up at someone or whatever the case is, because I thought, if I told you that, you were somehow going to judge me and you would look down on me. And so, I'm gaining through practice, I'm gaining some courage and strength to do that on a regular basis. In fact, right after this meeting, I'm going to do a 10 and 11 with one of the guys in my step group. And then finally, you said so much, it's funny you picked me, is the whole detached thing. My mother passed in May. She was 91. I barely shed a tear. And we were close. I'm a mama's boy. I'm a 63-year-old mama's boy, but I barely shed a tear. But when I see the little St. Jude's commercials with the little girl with no hair, with the chemo bag, I fall apart, but it's like, there's a kind of detachment in me. And I was talking to my sponsor about the other day that I just don't understand, but thank God you spoke tonight, because that lets me know that, because that was kind of like a dirty little secret. Like, I can't tell anybody I'm that detached. I mean, something's really wrong with me. But I got to hear from you tonight that, it's okay to be that. That's where I'm at as of today. And with work, and I did see a therapist last year, and who knows what'll happen in the future, but things like that it's okay to be in that space, and okay to ask for help, okay to be honest about it. You said some very, very important stuff for me, and I got a lot out of it, Derrick. I really, really appreciate your talk tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Emerson. Who wants to share? So show of hands. Dennis and Joanna.
Thank you, Derrick. This is Joanna, obviously, not Dennis. I'm an alcoholic, and I really appreciated your chair because I don't always relate to AA speakers. Sometimes I don't relate at all, actually. And it actually happened when I first came into recovery that it took me a real long time to identify with some other alcoholic, and certainly not the women. And mainly because, not because they were women, but because their stories were so vanilla that I couldn't relate to them. And what I related to finally is a Hispanic guy who obviously the details of his story were very different from mine. Well, you can't see me, but I look like a dog, but I'm not. And I was actually, I was born in Europe, so I'm a European, and what I related to with this guy was the depth of the pain, the depth of his emotion. I mean, the details were very different, obviously, but that didn't matter. What was important was I could relate. I had something to relate to in AA. And since then, I've come to consider AA as my home, and I've gone to meetings in other countries, and I know I'm coming home every time I go to a meeting. But it certainly took a long time to acquire this. And like I said, I don't always relate to the speakers, and I did relate to what you had to say. For example, I related to that perfectionism. Oh man, the overachiever that if I was in school or if I was just doing anything, I had to do 200% in order just to feel okay, just to feel like I have a right to be on this planet. It's not that I felt like I was achieving anything. It just gave me the right to kind of slide by. And so that I could really relate to because I experienced that. And, I mean, I do see AA as a program of solution and the steps as my answer. So I really practice the steps diligently because I need to. And the other thing which I was thinking about is that I don't think me or anybody else in this program or anywhere else likes to admit that we're vulnerable. I think that's why grandiosity and pride has such an appeal, because it's kind of it's not the truth, but it masks. It feels like we're invincible when we are in grandiosity. And who the hell wants to admit they're vulnerable? Not me, certainly. And so I think, anyways, I do think that I fall into that grandiosity thing because of that. And but my answer are the steps. And my answer is also kind of beyond the steps. In other words, step 4, I shared this before this meeting, that I add 2 columns, and one of them is what's the core beliefs, the conditioned beliefs that keep my part stuck like glue. And it's been very, very helpful to kind of do that investigation. It's hard to see because most of these beliefs are subconscious and they're long-term beliefs that we acquire and learn really well. I think you and I and a lot of alcoholics in this room, we're good students. You know, we're the ones who, the overachievers, the ones who want to, you know, always do the right thing. And so, yeah, we learn this really well and we keep it. And so it's hard to investigate, but it's really, really worthwhile. And the more I've been able to ask myself, is this the truth? As you know, as I investigate what's behind my part, it's really been freeing for me. So anyways, I thank you for your chair. I really appreciated it. And you know, I live in Washington State, and actually I was born in Brussels, but and I don't look like a dog, but that's okay. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for being here.
Thanks, Joanna. How about Summer?
Hi, I'm Summer. I'm an alcoholic. Thank you so much for your share. I identified so much with certain things that you said in the beginning about, you know, the religious upbringing. And, you know, I also grew up with the, like, if you don't believe exactly the way we believe, you know, you're going to hell. And I know you didn't say that word exactly, but the fire, you know, and also, you know, with the trauma and stuff, you just hit home. You know, we didn't celebrate Halloween. It's interesting that you mentioned the holidays. And I can remember as a kid turning all the lights out in the house, and we would duck down and hide under the couch and turn our front porch out. And if people knocked on the door, we wouldn't go to the door because we didn't participate in that. I was also homeschooled my whole life, but there was always just this disconnection. And you mentioned it, and I'm like, wow, you're like telling my story. But, you know, I'm doing some outside things, you know, trauma therapy and DBT therapy. And I'll tell you, it's hard, you know, because when you really start digging into like the roots of your, you know, struggles, it's like you know, I also think of, like, I was sharing with my sponsor last night, you know, it's hard to think that your parents are abusive, you know, or were when you were a kid. Like, no kid or adult wants to believe that. And it makes it, sometimes it's just hard. Like, I don't want to think that or believe that, you know, and it continues even as you're a grown up. Like, I'm living with my parents and sometimes it's hard, you know. Sorry, I'm getting a little, but like, you know, I was taught in this program about burning sage, you know, because it helps to clear out the energy. And, you know, my mom gives me the hardest time about that. Like, sometimes it's just like, wow, like almost like I feel like I'm evil. And I also appreciated that you shared about, like, there are dark things, you know. I've actually, like, last night it was on my mind, but I had an exorcism done. Like, I was in so much pain, and you don't hear that kind of stuff. You can't really talk about it, you know, in a regular, but like, that's something I'm never going to forget, you know. And it was real. I can tell you it was very real. And I do think that some of the struggles that I have are also like spiritual, and I don't know exactly where they come from, but I just appreciate, because the guy Emerson was also saying, it's like, I'm not able to always go in AA and be like, yeah, everything's all great and happy and positive, you know, and I want to be that way, but I'm not there. And so to feel that you can be real and say where you really are, it is a blessing, and it's almost a relief. Thank you so much for your share. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Summer. Veronica?
Hi, Derrick. Thanks so much. My name's Veronica and I am an alcoholic. Despite that the story is different, the circumstances are different, I related to a lot of what you said. The feelings there are exactly how it feels for me. Many of the ways in which you sound, what I heard, the way in which you operated, that's exactly what I do. I think probably one of the most important things for me that I've heard you say tonight is when you said, you know, that Don Pritz, so I actually wrote it down, he said, you can have a life that makes sense to you. You know, and this dirty little secret that someone else brought up. You know, I've been sitting in these rooms, and also like another person, I don't want to go back to in-face meetings. I'll get back to that in a second. But I've been sitting here listening to, you know, happy, joyous and free and a life beyond your wildest dreams. Do you know how far away that is for me? That is so far away from my reality and how I feel that, you know, that what Don Pritt said, you can have a life that makes sense to you. Now that is something I could anchor to, you know, even if it just makes sense to me. Never mind the fancy schmancy wonderful feelings that, you know, others seem to have. That's not my experience so far. I also am listening to, whether it was you or whether it was another, you know, talking about and I know you did touch on this, what I'm calling, you know, the disconnection from feelings. You know, when my dad died, I don't know, 26, 27 years ago. And by the way, I don't feel my heart. It's really bothered me for a long time. I just don't feel it. I don't know what's wrong. There's something wrong. There's something broken. Not that I've never felt it, but there's just a serious disconnect there. When my dad died, you know, I wanted to get into my suit and go to work because that's what I knew to do. And the only reason I didn't go that day, I went the next day, is because I thought people are going to think, what a callous bitch. You know, how weird is that? And, you know, it took a year. It took 2 years for me to, 2 weeks for me to finally break down in tears. And it was a year later where I got really, really sick and I almost died. And it was from the grief of the loss. That was my experience. It's, I guess really that's, I'll say one more thing. You know, I heard another talk about, you know, sitting in the car and pretending to be on the phone because you didn't want to go in. And, you know, the topic of small talk came up, and I always thought I didn't like small talk either. And as I'm, you know, sort of you know, how the thoughts just bounce together in a dotted line. And I went, yeah, I don't like small talk either. Yeah, I don't really don't want to deal with people. And it was I'm terrified of the intimacy. And this is a fellowship full of extraordinary people. I mean, this fellowship and this program is not for the faint-hearted. That is for sure. You know, it takes guts to do this, you know, however you do it. And I moved into a house 2 months ago, and I'm looking across into the room where I've still got a cabinet laying on its side because one of the legs needs to have a little bit of glue so that it can be put back upright so I can start unpacking boxes. And do you know, and this is another dirty little secret of mine, is that I've got nobody to call. I've got nobody to call to help. And when you were talking about, you know, what happens if I'm paraphrasing, but the floodgates of feelings open up? I've been afraid of that for a long time, way before I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. And the closest I can come to it is that if I connect with it, I'm going to fall apart. And I'm going to fall apart so far that there's no putting it back together again. But beyond that, the thought came that I'm going to fall apart, but there's going to be nobody there to help me. And it was also, well, there's no God in that either. So your talk tonight was so provocative for me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for giving me something to hang on to, you know, a life that might make sense to me rather than so beyond what I'm so far, you know, from what I feel so far away from, that, you know, the promises that are offered. So anyway, there we are. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Veronica. Irina?
Hello, everyone. My name's Irina, and I am an alcoholic. And I want to first say how much I love this meeting. When I hear Veronica reading Bill's letter suddenly all is right with my world. So thank you, Sam. Thank you, Dawn, and everyone else who puts this together. Derrick, I so appreciated your talk. You don't know. I don't cry. I hear people talking about it. When I first came in, I sat and cried for the first 3 months. And I've been around for a number of years and I still have yet to cry. I just don't know what that's all about. It's like someone said, I feel like something in me is broken. It just doesn't work. I'm just starting to name my feelings or to find words for them. I know fear. And I also know the prayer about fear that you ask God to remove it and it does go away. And I like that you ask God what he wants you to be rather than what to do. But as far as other feelings go, I still need to look at a chart to say, okay, this is what's going on. Here's the word for it. The other thing that really touched me was when you went through your surgery and your things that were going on, and you said you were doing it yourself. There was no God in that, and I do that inevitably and plowing along with what I think I should be plowing along on and stop and say, oh, God, is this your will or am I just plowing along? So I appreciated being reminded that that's not the way I need to be going. And I just do so appreciate your bringing up a subject that's puzzled me and hurt me for a really long time. And it's so good to know that I'm not alone, that I don't know what the solution is yet, but I think there is one. And now that I've come out with it, it's, I'm kind of like you too. I don't share much. I don't like to share. I don't do small talk. I prefer to hang in the background and just sort of be and get everything I can from this meeting. But you touched me so deeply, I just had to say something. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. Mary Thayer, I haven't heard from you in a minute. What do you got to say?
Hi, Derrick. Mary Thayer, alcoholic. Just listening to everything that happened and how we all relate at the pain or the brokenness that we come in with. And I was so lost. I didn't talk for almost 3 years when I came in. I just always sat in the back, or I sat on my hands, or I wanted to be invisible. But there was an energy in the room, and I kept hearing things that kept bringing me back. And it was an energy that I felt safe in the rooms. So the first time I got into any type of service, I was sitting in Radford, and I said I was bored, and somebody said, "You're self-obsessed," and quoted something out of the little red book or something, and said, "You need to get into service." And so I started going to County General Hospital to carry the message into the hospitals. The hospital was an alcoholic ward down there. And I remember the gift that I received by doing that. It was like you get outside yourself finally. But emptiness and loneliness and pain, yeah. I sometimes look back on, my journey through this recovery and realize that when I got kind of like a God zap to come and study death and dying in New Mexico and, get a degree in hospice and grief counseling, before I did that, I did, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross used to have intensive workshops called Life, Death, and Transition workshops. That was all really, it was all on trauma, loss, and grief. And I started going to those and actually got so involved in doing them for so long became a facilitator. And part of the work as a facilitator of these workshops is that we always had to continue to do our work. This is like the buzzword now. I've been hearing more and more people are finally getting into grief and trauma and how it affected them. And I can remember doing my work and going almost being regressed to the crib, if you will, and and the abandonment that I went through as a child, and not having anywhere except that now hindsight, these workshops introduced me to really they were just externalization of the first 5, 6 steps of our program. I had to know there was like this emptiness inside of me, and talk about the hole in the gut with the wind blowing through. And I'm grateful for the sponsorship I had, because I was given kind of permission to tell my story in the first person instead of the third person, because I was very detached. I mean, I didn't even know when Bev said to me, "You'll tell that in the first person, not the third." What are you talking about? She said, "God, you're talking about your life as if it was somebody down the road here that you don't really know and you heard about it. You know, there's some feelings connected with that. And one day you'll share those tears." And, but it took a long time for me to do that. And through the years, and with what I finally got to through my work on actually taking a look at the depth of pain that I had created a whole bunch of personas for, false personas, to relate. I remember when I walked into, I don't know, you know, I think every single one of them, us go into the halls and they say, "How you doing?" You know, somebody goes, "How you doing?" And you go, "Fine, how are you doing?" You know, it's such a phony mask after a while. You know, I remember the one time I went in and somebody said, "How you doing?" I said, "God, I'm just miserable." And I'll never forget, that person was not somebody that didn't have some depth and weight. And they turned to me and said, "Come here, let's have a cup of coffee." And then it started. And I think the whole thing has to be with what the honesty to admit something. If I had never admit, you know, it wasn't until I admitted I was alcoholic that things started to change. If I didn't admit that I was, depressed or angry or anything else, there's no way I can work on it. No way. I remember when I realized if I didn't, you know, it tells me that in the book. It says you have to admit to your innermost self something's going on here. And I realized that when I can finally admit things like that, then it's like the beginning. It's like, I don't know what to do. As soon as I say, I can't figure this out, it's almost like God goes, "Oh, good, now I can help." But it allows me to try to zoom around in my brain, for crying out loud, to figure everything out all by myself with that self-sufficiency. I identified tonight when you said, having been so sick and coming to that realization that without a presence in your life, you probably were going to die, even though you have almost 20 years of sobriety. I mean, at 20 years of sobriety, Derrick, I woke up and I went, what the F is the matter with me? I knew this book inside and out. I'd done everything, check off list. I'd done it right, you guys. I knew it, I could talk it, and I was using the steps to keep you in the verb, you know, everything when I talked to keep you away from me. And I realized I had that hole in my gut and the wind was blowing through. And I was filled with fear. And it was the realization that I kept thinking that I was going to get someplace and be all right. I didn't look at this as life, as somebody spoke about earlier. I looked at this as if I was never going to have a bad day. I think I saw Cinderella too much and we were going to live happily ever after or something. There's so many certain trials and low spots and along this journey. But one thing I have found is that if I don't drink or use or kill myself, on the other side of it, I know this God so much better. So it does takes a lot of, what do they say? People of faith have courage. It takes an enormous amount of courage to tell you who we are and where we're at the time. I know some of you people have heard me too much, maybe, but a couple of years back, I realized that safety was a lie for me. I kept running around saying, I think safety is a lie. And it wasn't that safety isn't bad. My perception of how to be safe was a lie. It wasn't safe for me to be just quiet and say nothing. I had to, if I was going to move in this program, I don't have to be safe. I have to be vulnerable. And I can't be vulnerable unless there's enough God on board for me. So for the last 28 years in my program, I've been trying to experience this thing at a level of what they used to say when I first came in. They used to say God is spelled R-I-S-K. So I take risks. I don't know the outcome. I show up, I pay attention, I tell the truth. I have no idea what the outcome is. And it's always better than I could have ever dreamed of. It really is. I'm glad you're in my life. I'm glad I've been able to watch you guys through the years. I've also found that the trials and low spots have introduced me to the realization I am going to have pain. I do believe there is necessary suffering for us to continue to grow closer and let go of our belief structure on what we think is going to make us safe. I don't think that those things happen until we have enough God on board. And you are an example, you are in a demonstration of trudging, walking slowly with purpose. But there was enough God on board, or you wouldn't be here tonight, Derrick. And thanks for your message. Thanks.
Well, Derrick, do you have any closing remarks?
I just want to say, I believe we're called upon to touch each other's lives as we move through them. And if I'm awake to it and I keep my eyes open, I get to recognize some of that sometimes. And after some of the stuff I said tonight, I felt like I was kind of hanging out there in the wind a little bit, but the shares after really touched me deeply to let me know I'm not alone and I'm not an emotional freak. I'm not all the lies that I tell myself. So, Veronica, Summer, Maggie, everybody who shared, thank you so much for your vulnerability and letting me know that I'm not alone. And that's all. Really, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Derrick. And Sam, would you like to help us close this?
I promised I wasn't going to say anything tonight, Don.
You're invited to suspend.
Yeah, so we're going to go to our inner room and mute ourselves and say the Lord's Prayer for all who care to join us. Great job tonight, Derrick. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys. Dawn, what a great meeting. Thanks for leading that for us tonight.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Good to
Hear
hear
from everybody.
Thanks
Thank you,
again,
Veronica.
Derrick.
Thank you, Derrick. Beautiful, man.
Thanks all.
Thanks again, everyone. And
Derrick.
thank you so much, Derrick. Good night.